Today we are going to be testing the newly released Ryzen 7 1700 CPU up against its closest competitor from Intel, the i7 7700K. AMD themselves have designated the 1700 processor to be in a very competitive price point at $329, directly competing with the $340 7700K. The 1700 is the lowest price SKU in the Ryzen 7 stack, behind the 1700 and 1800X, but sports the same 8 cores and 16 threads as its bigger brothers. The only difference besides the price is the out-of-the-box clock speed of 3 GHz and a lower TDP of 65 watts, which means we should expect to see it run a fair bit cooler than the 95-watt TDP SKUs from AMD. And I can tell you that is definitely true, as my 1700 idles at just under 30 degrees Celsius on a Noctua air cooler with 2 fans in a push-pull configuration. And that's with an overclock of 3.9 GHz at 1.3 volts. After running IDA 64 for just over an hour, the max temp that I saw was 57 degrees Celsius on air. That's roughly 20 degrees cooler than my 1800X that I tested recently at the same exact clock speed. The 1800X, however, required 1.35 volts in order to maintain the 3.9 GHz clock speed, and when testing the 1700 and 1800X at the same speed, they returned nearly identical performance. I think what this shows is, clock for clock, the Ryzen 7 CPUs are the exact same, and what you're essentially paying for is a higher guaranteed speed out of the box. Now, obviously, I only have one 1700 CPU to test, so I won't know until launch day what others are seeing for their overclocks. There's a good chance that I may have just been extremely lucky with my 3.9 gigahertz overclock at the 1.3 volts, so that's just the way the Silicon Lottery go. For our testing, I had both the i7 7700K and the R7 1700 overclocked to their highest stable point I could get. As previously mentioned, that put the 1700 at 3.9 GHz, 1.3 volts, while the 7700K is at 5 GHz and 1.365 volts, as I covered recently in my Frame Raider build. Both systems utilize 16 GB of DDR4 memory clocked at 3000 MHz. However, one was Corsair Vengeance LPX RAM and the other was a G-Skill Trident Z kit. Both motherboards were Gigabyte boards. For AMD, we had the X370 Gaming 5, and on the Intel side, we used the Z270K7 board that I recently used also in that Frame Raider build with the 7700K. For the graphics card, we used the GTX 1080, which is overclocked with 200 MHz on the core and an additional 300 MHz on the memory, and all of our games were tested at the Ultra preset at 1080p and 1440p. Starting off, we get a look at the averages at 1080p, and then we will move into the minimums as well as 1440p testing. I'll be honest that I was rather surprised with just how well the Ryzen CPU was able to keep up with the 5 GHz 7700K. We can see here that while Intel did take the majority of the titles tested, most of them were only by a few FPS. Games like The Division, Rainbow Six Siege, and Battlefield 1 leveraged the additional cores of the 1700, showing the potential of having an 8-core CPU for games that are optimized to take advantage of them. I think this is going to be very important proving ground as we move forward with more developers working on multi-threaded utilization. Those results we saw continue over with the minimums, where the 1700 and the 7700K are neck and neck in the majority of the games. GTA 5 and Rise of the Tomb Raider are exceptions, where Intel seems to pick up a larger margin of victory, but yet again we see the 1700 winning in The Division and Battlefield 1. I did also want to include 1440p testing for people that were curious about the performance they could see with a Ryzen CPU at higher resolutions, but nothing really changes here with our results against Intel because we are depending solely on the pixel throughput of the GTX 1080 to handle having more pixels on screen, so we don't get to see any really big surprises here. Once again, AMD wins out in The Division, Rainbow Six Siege, and Battlefield 1, but falls behind on other games tested. And lastly, I will show you guys the minimums for 1440p up on your screen, although there really isn't much to say about these because we are really just seeing the same exact story as 1080p, only with fewer frames per second. I will touch on Overwatch for those of you that may be curious as to why it's tying the minimums and the averages and why it's so close as well to the averages. That's because Overwatch has a CPU bottleneck where it is only utilizing 2 cores at any one time, so that prevented our GTX 1080 from really seeing its true potential. So at the end of all of this, would I recommend an R7 1700 over the Intel i7 7700K? Yes, I would, depending on what you expect to get out of it. I think the performance we are seeing here is close enough that the benefits of having an 8-core, 16-thread processor for the future is going to be extremely beneficial for gamers in the long run, but it really comes down to what games you're going to be playing. If Battlefield 1 is your bread and butter and you want the most FPS possible, then it would benefit greatly from having a CPU with more cores and threads like a Ryzen processor. Also, another thing to consider is content creation. Having those additional cores and threads can add up to nearly 50% faster performance for highly intensive multi-threaded workloads like video editing or game streaming. I do plan to do a follow-up video on this shortly after launch day where I'll be testing game performance during a live stream to see how much our performance is impacted between these processors, so stay tuned and be subscribed for that video. One thing is for sure, AMD Ryzen is here in a very big way, and it seems to have delivered on the promises it's made in the months leading up to its release. AMD had a plan to come in and crush the competition with Intel, and I think they're managing to get right in there to be truly competitive again. This is something that will only benefit us consumers, as it will force Intel to innovate sooner and even drop its prices, which has already begun to happen. But I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here. I will leave a link down below in the description over to Amazon where you could pick up either the AMD Ryzen 1700 or the Intel i7 7700K. But I'll catch you guys next time.